Hi, I'm Azeem Azhar, and you're listening to Exponential View, a weekly podcast in which I explore all the ways our world is changing under the force of technology. My next guest, Michael Liebreich, is a world authority on clean energy and the transformation of the transportation sector. Now, if you're a first-time listener, you might want to know that this second season of the Exponential View podcast is all about the political economy of technology. In previous episodes, I spoke to economists, investors, entrepreneurs, and policymakers shaping the future of society and technology. So you might want to browse through the archives and subscribe to receive a new mind-expanding conversation each week. Now to today's podcast. Our guest is Michael Liebreich, a world-recognized expert in clean energy and transportation. He was most recently on the board of Transport for London. He founded the #1 data and analytics company focusing on clean energy, new energy finance, all the way back in 2004. It was a time when very few people believed clean energy was really a thing. I was lucky enough to meet Michael back then and became an early investor in the business, which was ultimately acquired by Bloomberg. I start my conversation with Michael trying to understand how he began his journey into clean energy. For the next few weeks, the Exponential View podcast is sponsored by Spotify. I'm a massive fan of Spotify, and they've now added another killer feature, a podcast hub, where you can get your favorite shows, including this one. So next time you launch Spotify, search for Exponential View and pick up the next episode there.
So at the time in 1995, I was working for a news agency. It was called Associated Press Television. It's now been amalgamated with some other things. It's APTN. And it was just a news story that this very charismatic activist, Ken Saro-Wiwa, had been protesting the pollution caused by Shell's activities or the oil extraction and then various other sort of things going on in the on the Agoni lands in the Delta. And but at the time, I don't want to say that was what sort of made me decide that the system had to change root and branch. So it was at the time only a news story, but it was one that manifestly was horrific, was unfair. But also, the problem at that time was, well, what do you want to do about it? We all need oil. We don't have alternatives. So there was a strong temptation to just almost turn a blind eye and say, well, these are the sort of bad things that happen in that industry, but look at all the good that it does as well. And it wasn't the catalyst for me to do anything, but it was just one stone in a fairly broad foundation. And then a bunch of other things came together to do with sort of seeing what experience curves would do to cost and a whole load of things, geopolitics, particularly the Second Gulf War. So by 2003-04, there was this kind of broad foundation of individual things that made me think, right, I have to be in this issue. This is where it's going to be sort of happening for the next few decades. And this is where I want to play. And
that's when you founded New Energy Finance.
Yes, that's right.
I was lucky enough to be an investor in. It became the #1 analytic and data source for what is now quite a significant investment pool in clean energy.
Well, that's right. I mean, so at the time when I started it, I don't think I could have foreseen how far clean energy and now clean transportation has come in, whatever it was, 14, 15 years. I founded it in 2004, by 2003, I was thinking only about, these issues, particularly around energy. Transport hadn't started, but I don't think I could have forecast just how fast the costs would drop, the impact would grow. But that was when I founded it, and I really came into it still much more as an entrepreneur. I just wanted to build an information business and then sell it and make some money because I really needed to do that.
And in that time, the market around clean energy and transport has increased, expanded significantly. We've also had many, many more warnings, I guess, about the impact and the climate change and how that seems to be looming on us. Just a few weeks ago, we had the latest US National Climate Assessment, which was pretty stark. We also had President Trump make some comments on it. When you hear comments like the ones that come from Trump, what do you feel?
Well, yes, things have moved much quicker. So just to put some numbers around that, investment in renewable energy and sort of energy efficiency and carbon capture and power storage, that whole kind of all of the technologies of the future, not including gas and nuclear, which will be part of it, but the other stuff has grown from, it was about 100 billion when I started the company, just under 100 billion
per annum, right?
Per annum, globally. And it's grown to 350 billion. It did that it hit 350 billion around 2011,
right,
and has gone flat since then. But the costs have dropped. So there's a lot more going on now than there was in 2011 because costs have dropped by more than half.
That's right.
So it's about $1 in every 6, just to kind of give an order of where are we in the stock take. $1
in every 6.
$1 in every 6 invested in energy.
Yeah.
Everything, upstream, downstream, electricity, gas, coal, nuclear, and so on. $1 in 6 is going into the sort of the really clean solutions. So that's where we are. In terms of, yes, over that period, the urgency of climate action has increased, dramatically. We now have got, this sort of a really robust hard science set that says that we've got to do something and a good understanding of the timeframes. Before I get onto the US National Climate Assessment, the most recent report from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, was on 1.5 degrees. How important is it that we keep warming to 1.5 degrees, and what do we need to do to get there? And I mean, in summary, it's really important. Really bad things happen after 2 degrees, but actually quite a lot of them happen after 1.5 degrees, and that's hard science. That's not. There's a load of politics around stuff, but the hard science says bad things happen at 1.5. The physics and chemistry say that we can we can stay below there. But we're talking about now over the next sort of 10, 12, 15 years, quite dramatic things have to happen to stick to 1.5, as in, 45% reduction in emissions, or we will run out of carbon budget entirely. That sort of, which is quite a very stark.
Yeah. Can you just remind us where we are with the carbon budget? What's the current scientific consensus on the total? How much have we used, and what are we using each year?
So in terms of, there's this concept of a carbon budget. How much can we emit before we run into trouble? And remember that the CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So it sort of doesn't matter whether we emit it this year, next year, or in 10 years, or in 20 years, because once it's up there, it's going to continue to drive what they call solar forcings. In other words, more energy coming in from the sun than leaves, and the temperature will continue to go up. And it's very important, by the way, to realize that capping emissions, just stopping emissions growth, is not enough, right? Because if you stop their growth, there's still two things. Number one, you're still putting out some each year, so more and more is accumulating in the atmosphere, and also the stuff that's up there. Even if we absolutely stopped emissions today, the stuff in the atmosphere will continue to force heat into the planet for hundreds of years. So the challenge is not to cap emissions; it is to eliminate them, and that's really important that everybody understands that. So we've got, I think the number is 580 gigatons. I don't get too fixated on the numbers because there's Google and Wikipedia and stuff for that sort of stuff. Absolutely. To go if you really need to get into the numbers. But broadly speaking, the current rate that we are emitting will use that budget by 2030. That's the important thing. We've got 12 years. Now, that will be for 1.5 degrees. If you say, well, we'll go to 2 degrees, because, there's also a lot of economic activity pulls people out of poverty, and there's things we need to do and so on. So if you could say, well, we can live with 2 degrees and hope to manage the worst outcomes, then you've still got to reduce emissions by 20, 25, 30 degrees by 2030. So it's still dramatic. But you've got a bit longer to get to the sort of halving of emissions. But we've got to eliminate them by 2050, 2060. We have to be at a net zero carbon economy globally. And I think I look at the 2030. I'm looking more and more at the 2030. And one of the things I do is I go around the world and I talk to political leaders. I was at the G20 energy ministers, and I go and talk to OECD or individual governments. And I also talk to investors, pension fund, leadership teams, and corporates. And I'm getting them to focus on 2030 because it's just 2 business cycles away. And it's not, if you say, well, we have to eliminate emissions by 2050, then everybody goes, well, so that's kind of my kids' problem and they're really smart, they'll figure it out. No, if you think about 2030, where you have to have either reduced emissions by a third or a half, quarter to a half, let's say, or you're in a situation where there's no carbon budget. Yeah. The social license to emit at that point will be gone. And that is going to be the environment that you finish your career in. And if you're an investor, you can then say, so what portfolio of investments would you like to sit on at that point?
Right.
If you're a corporate, what businesses do you want to run at that point? And then you start saying, well, what do you want to do, this afternoon? What do you need to do tomorrow to start that journey over 2 business cycles, just 2 business cycles, to get to where you need to be when you hand over your legacy as CEO, as board directors, as
the head of this pension fund,
or as a pension fund manager and so on.
Yeah,
so that's my sort of broad concept of how I think about the timing. And then you asked about what do I think of Trump? Well, obviously, when he says he doesn't believe the hard scientists that have put together the National Climate Assessment. I mean, what can I say? I think it's ridiculous. I think that, it's absolutely clear from his statements that he doesn't understand the difference between, let's say, pollution, in a sense, normal air pollution of, particulates or sulfur dioxide or whatever. He doesn't understand the difference between that and greenhouse gases, which cross borders, which linger in the atmosphere, and which cause not just local. It's not just a question of one local biome, one local ecosystem. Right. This is a global threat, and sea level rise alone. He needs to think about them. Here he is in Mar-a-Lago.
He lives by the coast. But it's an interesting point you raise about air pollution. So I wonder whether air pollution will end up being a somewhat of a useful fillip as a way of getting people to think about what we put into the atmosphere because they can feel it. I mean, even if the science is not closely connected, it could be a way of motivating and mobilizing, because many of the solutions to pull air pollution out of the air are similar to the ones that we need to decarbonize.
Now, so air pollution is already a major driver of change, and you only have to look at European cities talking about banning internal combustion vehicles by whatever year to see that, because then you start saying, well, in that case, why jump from diesel to petrol if you're going to have to go to electric or some other solution anyway? And so it's definitely a forcing, driver. There is just one slight sort of oddity, which is that actually taking particulates out of the air might actually accelerate the warming because at the moment they're up there. There is a cooling impact.
Not so good for our lungs, but...
Well, no, and in a sense, you've just got to sort of take that. You've got to take that. Let's get rid of the lot of it. Let's jump to. I tell you, from all the work I've done, 15 years plus the academic work that I did before, we can move to a clean, resilient, affordable system. I've absolutely no doubt. I'm a huge believer in. Well, first of all, there's nothing in the physics or the science that says we can't.
You're an entrepreneur. You're in the sense naturally have to be an optimist about this. But there are people who I really respect. Václav Smil is a energy historian and scientist who's sort of said, well, hoping that we can make a quick transition might be wishful thinking. Yeah. What are you actually seeing in terms of the transition and how it's happening? You've described this framework of the 3/3 world, and maybe that's a useful lens for us to use. Perhaps let's talk about electricity generation, where we have been generating through burning coal and oil and LNG, and now we've seen a growth in solar and wind. How are they starting to compete?
Let me back up and talk about the sort of, I'd call it the Václav Smil view of the world, which is that all these things are incredibly slow. That transition from wood to coal was very slow. I don't know, it was more than a century, and from coal to oil and so on, very slow. And therefore, he's particularly skeptical about renewable energy. But to a certain extent, he's fighting a straw man, which is that renewable energy, renewable electricity will be, 100% of the answer. And and I sort of, so there are people who say that, and I think that I've got deep skepticism about that. But what I come back with is this concept of I call it the 3/3 world, which is 2040, 1/3 of electricity will be wind and solar. 1/3 of the vehicles that you see on the streets will be electric, and the global economy will be 1/3 more efficient in its use of energy. And the reason I use that is to try to sort of defuse the polarization between Václav Smil saying it'll never happen and the other people saying, no, we've got to go to 100% renewables and it's all doable quite quickly and so on. And there is, there is this middle space in a sense where we are going. And by the way, the 3/3 world is way beyond what I could have predicted when I started New Energy Finance in 2004.
And is the 3/3 world enough to cap the carbon budget?
No. Well, yes, it will be enough to cap it, but as I've explained, what you've got to do is eliminate the emissions, not cap them. So the 3/3 world will cap them, but it won't eliminate them. And so we've got to go far beyond the 3/3 world.
Right. So now,
that's where we're headed.
We're
headed to the 3/3 world.
Our challenge is how do we accelerate?
But we've got to go beyond that, and we've got to go beyond in electricity. So whether it's with more wind and solar, or whether it's with nuclear, or whether it's with more efficiency, but we've got to go in those areas of electricity, transport, and efficiency. We've got to go well beyond. And then we've got to get into difficult things like heat, which is extremely hard, space heating, homes, offices. We've got to get into industrial processes. And we've got to get into the bits of transport which are difficult for electric. And those are principally the long distance ones, ships that go 5,000 miles and long distance trucking and trains, which all the short distance stuff I could see going electric. And, beyond 2040, it's not going to stop. The thirds there will continue going, but long distance transport and things like, chemicals, we're talking about physical stuff that has to also be net carbon neutral.
Down winding streets, beyond the dreaming spires, inside the college walls, debates are happening. Future Makers from the University of Oxford invites you to that debate. Join me, philosopher Peter Millikan, and 3 experts as we discuss the movements that are shaping the future of our society. Our first series is all about artificial intelligence, and we'll be exploring topics from the future automation of jobs to the inherent bias of algorithms, and even the impact AI may have on our health. That's Future Makers, available to download now.
You've raised a couple of interesting points. I'd like to just dig into each one sort of separately. You talked a bit about heat there. And one of the things that I've seen when I've been studying the energy systems is this fantastically beautiful diagram. It's called a Sankey diagram. And if people Google it, Sankey, and it shows how energy comes in and how it gets used. And one of the things that I've spotted about the Sankey diagram is that it's sort of very linear. Stuff goes in, stuff comes out, and it gets chucked away. But we don't really live in a linear system like that, because the stuff that gets chucked away, actually, we live with its consequences. How important has the Sankey diagram been in helping or not helping, actually, the debate around changing the energy system?
So I think it's the Sankey plays a number of important roles. I mean, the first is just to understand, we've got the lights on in this studio. Where does that actually sort of come from? Because you need to do that even for things like understanding where cyber risk might be in the process, or where the geopolitics might play into whether we can have this light on or not. Because you have to know, where is this gas from Russia that's powering it, or is it? So the Sankey diagram tracks all of that back. And I think that it's I don't know quite when its origins were, but it's used now very often, though, to show, in a sense, the futility of trying to change, because you see this huge input, which is coal, and you see a huge input, which is gas, and a huge input, which is oil. And it sort of, it deflates you when you try to think about, well, those are all the things that are causing the emissions. But it's really important to look at the other end of the Sankey diagram, where 2/3 of the input energy, they call it the primary energy, 2/3 of it goes up the chimney as waste heat. And so our challenge is not to replace all the inputs. Our challenge is to replace the outputs. What you really want is the light on in this studio. We're not trying to replace the amount of coal dug up in Silesia or wherever that we might be using for that. What you want is the lights to be on. And so when you reframe it, so you'll get people, Václav Smil does this a bit, but somebody like Bjorn Lomborg, he'll,
obsessive about it, right?
He's constantly talking about how wind and solar are, less than 1%, or it's now around 1% of primary energy. But it's the stupidest possible thing to focus on, because that primary energy, 2/3 of it's waste. Why are you comparing a technology which is, number one, electric, not a general sort of energy, it's not an energy carrier like coal, but number two, doesn't produce thermal waste. You shouldn't measure wind and solar's impact by whether or not they can produce thermal waste. You don't want them to produce thermal waste. Yeah. So when it comes to, if you say, look, let's get sensible, and look at them as electricity providers, they are now, I think 2017, they were at about 6% of all electricity in the world is wind and solar. By the end of 2018, because there's been growth, it's probably something like 7.5%.
And I think in the UK,
from nowhere a decade ago, So,
in the UK, we've had 50% days, 60% days of renewables this year, I believe.
Right,
which is quite a milestone.
I think it was 33%, 30 or 33% wind alone. Last week.
Right. It's been windy. Yeah. But it raises another point. When I think of something getting to 1% market penetration in a market where it hadn't anything 10 or 15 years ago, coming from the internet space, that's an incredible milestone. I mean, that's the point at which an investor will double down on a product, particularly if it's growing very quickly. And I think it's been fascinating when I've been tracking the data that you have been putting out in your post New Energy Finance days of the cost of solar electricity, which I'm looking at it now, sort of 7 or 8 years ago was running to 8 cents to 15, 17 cents per kilowatt hour. 3 years ago had not quite halved. And then this year we were seeing records at below the 2 cent mark for contracts in Mexico, mostly 1.77 cents per kilowatt hour. I mean, I think as a UK consumer, I pay something between 8 and 10p, which is, I guess, between about 11 and 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Yeah. For my electricity. So there's something going on in solar electricity generation. And I'm curious, though, how's it managed to decline at this rate, a rate that I would normally only think of in terms of software? It's sort of exponential rather than linear, isn't it?
So it's absolutely exponential. I mean, what we're seeing, and in fact, you can go back further. You can go back to the first solar cells, which were installed in satellites in the 1970s. And we're talking about costs that have come down by more than 99% over that time period. And what's been quite extraordinary is they follow this very nice experience curve. It's sort of similar to Moore's law, but Moore's law Moore's law is an exceptionally fast sort of special case of an experience curve, and it's fast because the number of chips just continues to explode. Solar is not growing at quite those rates because there's some physical stuff,
and there's inertia as well.
But there's it needs some complementary technologies because it's variable. I mean, the sun doesn't shine at night. You're also constrained by the complementary technologies that you need, and that's something that will become perhaps more important in the future. But so it's scaling very fast and it's pushing down the costs very fast. And what's amazing is that, in a sense, is that people are surprised. I mean, a solar panel is essentially a flat screen TV but a lot simpler. Right. And why wouldn't its costs behave in a similar way? So we've seen these cost reductions. You mentioned some numbers of cents and yes, so solar and wind, the best projects in the world, producing power at below 2 US cents per kilowatt hour. Put that in perspective. Gas, coal might be producing at 6, 8, 10 cents in the US. You go to places like Africa and building a new gas-fired power station, it might even be more. But then the solar and wind might be a little bit more as well. What we're seeing is, it's going to continue to drop. So we're going to see 1 cent solar. It's just a matter of time to wait for that. Now, when you compare it though to your UK electricity bill, the problem there is you're comparing it to retail electricity prices. These are wholesale prices. Right. So we'll see wholesale wind and solar at 2 cents and below, it's the cheapest form of electricity ever generated anywhere in the world from any technology. And that's in sort of,
and there's no pollution to
and there's
price
no
in.
and dramatically lower externalities, etc. But it's not yet in your home, and it's not yet at night, and it's not so there's some there are other costs involved. But it is transforming, and one of the things it's doing is it's causing, in a sense, much more disruption than the percentages would suggest. You talked about reaching a 1% threshold. We're at say 6 to 8% now globally, and what it does is it destroys the price formation mechanism because it's zero marginal cost, and it appears when it wants to, not necessarily when you need it. So it gets dumped on the market. So it destroys the wholesale price. It removes a lot of conventional generation used to make its best sales during the day when demand was highest. And now solar power is actually depressing prices during the day, and the high prices might be at night. So it's
Economy 7 is, as we used to have in the UK, was the nighttime electricity pricing.
Exactly.
But often you're even seeing, I think in some places in the US, in California and Nevada, negative solar prices. How does that work?
Well, so if there's
negative electricity prices at midday,
right,
when the sun is at the
you'll see that also in Europe. And what happens is if you earn either a feed-in tariff, so you earn a fixed amount for producing electricity, whether it's used or not, or if you get a tax break for producing electricity, whether it's used or not, then the prices can even go negative. And of course, there are a lot of people that say, solar is eating its own lunch. Well, it's like, first of all, it's eaten the other technology's lunch first. Right. But then it's also negative prices or low prices at midday is an enormous spur to innovation. That is one of the things that will drive the uptake of batteries or electric vehicles that can then take advantage of opportunistic advantage of low electricity prices. And that's going to be the battle of the next few decades.
You're going to see this strange thing where there'll be surge pricing on your Uber or Lyft at noon because they're all parked up, recharging, getting there.
It probably won't. I think the battery will buffer that. What you'll see is, what you will see is, in a sense, surge pricing for recharging the Ubers and the Lyfts or your own car, so that you'll say, well, I'll plug it. I want it to be parked somewhere during the day because the electricity will be really cheap. And it has implications for instance, if you have charging at home, but you use your car to drive to work, you'll probably tell your boss to install a charger because you want that cheap daytime electricity. There's no point coming home and then having all the expensive power at night.
It's very interesting, this idea that we'll literally move our electricity storage with us in our vehicle for a while. Now, one thing I track is the IEA World Energy Outlook, which is, I guess it's the International Energy Agency.
Yeah.
Right. And for years, they've made forecasts for the amount of solar capacity that's going to be added, and for years they've got it wrong. There's actually a Twitter user called Auki Hostra who publishes their sort of wrong forecasts and says, "Look, they've got it wrong again," regularly. Why do they get something like this wrong so often? I mean, they're smart people. They're plugged into the industry.
They're very, very smart, and they're very good friends. And I have enormous respect. The IEA does an incredible job, bringing in all of this data and forming an internally consistent view of the energy system and where it's going to go. But they have been repeatedly wrong-footed on not just solar but also wind and the speed of uptake. And they will say, well, what we produce is not a forecast. The problem is it sort of cracks like a forecast, swims like a forecast. So as far as everybody else is concerned, it is a forecast. I think there's a few reasons why it's been very difficult. Partly it's that wind, solar, batteries, and actually interestingly also fracking are much more industrial sort of technologies than they are traditional energy resource technologies. So the economics are driven much more by experience curves,
figuring out how to do it better with every cycle,
and learning effects.
Yeah.
I think there are some institutional constraints because they have members who are these sort of big countries that don't, I can sit, I'm nobody. I can sit there and say, solar's we're going to see 1 cent solar within the next decade. And if I'm wrong, I just live with the consequences and whatever. That's very different if you have major, funding from governments and you're expected to play this role in, their original role is around energy security in the face of the threat of OPEC actions, right? So they are about security, not about, forecasting, building castles in the air. So I have a lot of understanding, but when you've got it wrong sort of 14 times in a row, then, and when it is disruptive, when those mistakes are disruptive, it's not a little thing that happens at the edge of the system. This is disrupting price formation in the major, power markets of the world, and you've missed it. I think that, and it's not just the IEA. I mean, the same, the EIA, which is the US Energy Information Agency, is even worse. I mean, literally, you'll look at the two forecasts and you'll be like, the solar industry, which is installing 100 gigawatts plus or minus now. You look at the EIA forecasts and they say, well, it's going to be 20 gigawatts, 25 gigawatts a year going forward. It's like, how is that possible? There are single Chinese companies that are going to be producing 45 gigawatts of solar cells, single companies, and there's multiple ones. So they are unthinkably wrong. And, what can I say?
I'm going to let you pause there, because one of the things that you started to do with your work a few years ago was think a lot about the transportation transition as well. And you were on the board of Transport for London, which must be one of the world's greatest metropolitan transit authorities. Let's just talk a little bit about the transportation shift, maybe with the starting point of what real progress needs to be made and what is being made. Just a reminder, this podcast is sponsored by Spotify. I'm a massive fan of the service, and I'm delighted that Spotify has now launched a podcast hub. This means you can find all the episodes of the Exponential View podcast there, launch the app, and search Exponential View. Now, back to our conversations.
Well, so now that we see a very clear pathway to decarbonizing electricity, because we talked about the sort of the 3/3 world, electricity 1/3, but don't forget there's also coal to gas shifting, and there's so energy efficiency improvements on. So we can kind of see what's happening in electricity. The next biggest piece of emissions actually comes out of transportation, and I think it's overtaken in the US. Transportation has now overtaken the power sector for emissions. So we absolutely have to get a grip on that. And it's funny. I went back to something I wrote early in the history of new energy finance around 2008. And I said there were three battling trends. One was biofuels at the time. One was fuel cells and hydrogen. And one was super efficient internal combustion engines. And that would be the future of transport. And of course, I put my hand up, and I'm happy to accept that one was an absolutely horrible forecast.
Fuel cells,
what I didn't forecast, of course, was Elon Musk and the absolutely galvanizing effect that Tesla has had, and also some of the underlying economics. And what we now see is, first of all, electric is the way that transportation is going. For anything under 200 or 300 miles, maybe even 400 miles, will go electric. Any weight, not just cars. But heavy vehicles, buses, garbage trucks, the ferries, buses, even potentially some parts of aviation. But what's also clear is that fuel cells for anything that competes in that sort of shorter distance is an absolutely hopeless solution. I'm very bullish on hydrogen elsewhere to get beyond those sort of 3/3, but in things like heating and seasonal storage and industrial processes.
That's right.
And not in transportation.
Yeah, there is a potential, I guess, for hydrogen to form large-scale batteries as well, because the energy density might be better and might be cheaper than certain types of lithium technologies.
Interestingly, you say energy density, but actually the Toyota Mirai fuel cell car is actually heavier than the Chevy Bolt and the Tesla 3 and the Nissan Leaf. So it's actually heavy. And if you think about it, it's sort of obvious, because they've got, you've got all these big tanks, and you've got to have big fuel cells, and you've got to have all sorts of, you still got to have a battery. And, if you look at, I'm not sure people realize how simple battery electric vehicles are. You've got the battery, you've got electric motors, suspension system, and windscreen wipers.
Pretty much the most complex thing is the audio system, as far as I can tell in those things. We've seen these teardowns where people have stripped a traditional ICE internal combustion engine car, 100,000 parts, and then the Tesla with a handful. And I've read a couple of long-term tests of people who've had the Model S, and over 200,000 miles, they've had to replace the brake pads, seems reasonable, and the windscreen wipers.
And the tyres.
And the tyres, yes, right. So,
no, and indeed, and in fact, even things that we worry about, like the performance of the batteries and how quickly they degrade, the outcomes have been, pretty good. So, 95% performance after 100,000 miles, that sort of order of magnitude. And it's not just the Tesla. I mean, it's across the big manufacturers. So the batteries look like lasting pretty well as well.
So is this something where we can just let Mr. Market do its thing? The experience curve is going to improve costs. That's going to increase demand. It's going to turn entrepreneurs and large companies towards it. And we can just say, this will solve itself in the way that the market has always done well, or are there other levers that need to be pulled?
So it will solve itself, but not at the speed that that the climate imperative would have. So I have no doubt whatsoever that that electricity will go clean and transportation will go clean. Maybe not the long distance transportation is a bit harder, but it'll go because fundamentally burning a fuel it's not just pollution, which will which you should pay for and will cost more and more for whatever reason, but also it's a waste. Why buy expensive do expensive things if you've got solar power? A solar panel is made of sand. It's just this is just not.
And the light is not going to land anywhere.
It's going to get very cheap. Yeah. And the batteries you need for mobility as well as for storage, as well as to help the grid. So I've got no doubt that we're in this transition, and it's beyond any sort of stopping point. The question is, do you want it to get there before by 2070, by 2090, or by 2030 or 40 for climate and environmental reasons? And then, of course, there's the beyond the 3/3, or beyond beyond electricity and electric vehicles. What are you going to do about heat, where it's much, much more difficult, and industrial processes where it's much, much more difficult. The innovations are not quite as clear. Heat, the biggest problem we have, particularly in a country like the UK, is we've built a lot of gas boilers and a lot of central heating systems that are.
We must have 23 million of them, right? Where every
not
household.
Quite. So we've got some CHP, we've got some other,
right.
but we've got a lot of systems, and we've got multi-occupier homes and so on. But we've got tens of millions of systems that are optimized around fossil fuel burning, and so there's a big when people say, oh well, we'll just move to fuel cell, or we'll move to heat pumps, we'll just do it electrically. Well. Yeah, but think of the cost in any individual house of ripping out your gas boiler and your central heating and move to the heat pump based system. It's probably a £10,000-15,000 thing to do, and then you multiply it by tens of millions of homes, and you start thinking, well, hang on a second, this is hundreds of billions, and that's obviously we need to be a bit more creative than that. There'll be a lot of that, and new build. I mean, no new build should be connected to the gas network anymore. It's just not. It's not needed, and it's not a clever way to do it.
Right. So, can I come back though to the question of what is the role of the non-market actors in making this happen faster? Is it to increase the rate of carbon taxes, or to encourage investment through tax credits? What are the feed-in tariffs being locked in? What are the things they should be doing?
The first thing I'd say is I think the way to the lens through which to see all of this is around innovation, which is why I'm so happy to be on this podcast, by the way, because we're not going to get where we need to be by slowing down or by immediately start thinking of innovation. You start thinking of, well, what is the ecosystem that best delivers innovation, which is governmental involvement, perhaps definitely in earlier stage, etc. But it's also about rolling it out and getting it into the hands of users and consumers, which is typically done much better by the private sector.
Right.
And so I'd come at it through that lens, rather than just saying, carbon pricing, because the traditional answer is carbon pricing. Well, the answer is, I'll give you one example to prove that carbon pricing alone won't do it. In Europe, our petrol and diesel costs a lot more than in the US because it's taxed very highly. You could construe that as a carbon price, well into the tens of dollars. I think even I'm not quite sure what the number translates as, but we still use petrol and diesel here in Europe. Mm-hmm. So just going to a country, going to the US and saying we're going to put a big carbon tax on petrol and diesel and drive the prices up to European levels. Well, it might stop people buying SUVs in quite the numbers that they're buying and trucks, but it won't choke off demand to zero, which is where it needs to be by 2040 or 2050.
Right. So it's one part of the toolkit.
And so and in certain, where you've got businesses, where you've got power generators, carbon prices are very, very good at saying, right, today it's cheaper to use gas than coal, and then you'll switch the dispatch decision. They're much less effective at longer term decisions because they're volatile. Right. For capital decisions, you tend to sort of trade at a discount. Black-Scholes option pricing theory would explain it. We sort of discount the value of them in a long-term decision. So they don't drive infrastructure nearly as well as they just drive dispatch decisions. But they're also not enough. I mean, they don't fill the pipeline with new technologies, with deep research into the sort of the graphenes and the nano this and the blockchain that and so on. And they don't sort out also other problems, politically driven economic problems, like, for instance, right now, overall, on average in the world, the carbon price is not actually positive; it's actually negative. As a species, we're being paid to pollute because we've got fossil fuel subsidies. Right. So the total amount spent on fossil fuel subsidies is actually more than the aggregate of all the places where there are carbon prices. And so, just having a bunch of wealthy, enlightened, woke countries, putting carbon prices on everything will not solve the problem of all of those countries that are still having old-fashioned belief that cheap energy drives economic growth.
Which it has historically.
But there's no question that coal unlocked a vast amount of economic growth and progress and so on. The thing is that at the time, though, energy was probably, tens of % of GDP or of value add in the economy. And now, manufacturing in the UK is, 11%, 10 or 11%, 12%. And the energy component of that is probably a couple of %. It's just, right now, case in point, big discussion in Germany about when to shut their coal-fired power stations. The coalition government has got a coal commission, and the activists want it, quickly. And the question is, will it be before 2040? 2040, are they having a laugh? In the UK, we went from 42% coal in 2012 to less than 5%, probably 3% today. Amazing. That was just, 6 years.
That's right.
But in Germany, they're convinced that this would be enormously damaging for their, for their economy and for their manufacturers. But, mostly what they're selling is high value, obviously it's cars, but it's also things like printing machinery and food processing machinery. And you're not telling me that if the energy content of a German printing rig, if that energy content, which might be 3 or 4% in the end product, if that went to 4 or 5% and the prices went up by, but you're not telling me that everybody's going to start saying, right, fine, we'll just buy the Chinese one.
Right, absolutely.
This is German engineering we're talking about here.
You talked about the key role of innovation, and we have thousands of founders who listen to this podcast and hundreds of investors as well. One of the areas that I find particularly interesting is what novel chemistries and biochemistries will we need in a world where we don't have feedstock from oil, which has produced our plastics and so on. But what areas would you be asking or wanting entrepreneurs to look at?
So I think where we are in energy, transport, infrastructure, and sort of the relationship with particularly venture type investors and venture type entrepreneurs, it's actually a pretty good place, because one of the other things that I didn't get to in terms of why has solar and also wind, why have the costs come down, is also that those industries have become pervaded by software. And now the way you locate wind turbines, the way you optimize them, the way you predict maintenance, machine learning, the data management piece has been incredibly important. And there are whole companies doing that and doing very well and making a lot of money. So I think the software side of things is now well understood, and it will go across vehicles, vehicle charging, peer-to-peer type business models in utilities and so on. But you mentioned biochemistry, and there was more than a flirtation. There was a headlong, massive love affair fling with clean tech in 2000 and what are we talking about? 2005, 6, 7, 8, which ended in a huge disappointment and bust. And I think it was to do with the venture capitalists who came surging into the space, just didn't understand the difference between kit and bits,
right,
and the scalability. These are, at the end of the day, what the stuff I'm talking about is the physical infrastructure that surrounds us, because time constants have accelerated enormously. You know, the spread of information about, oh, there's this new stuff called coal and you don't need to burn, trees anymore or whatever. The spread of that information compared to the spread of information about a synthetic fuel or whatever is it's chalk and cheese, completely different. Nevertheless, they are physical sectors. I'm very optimistic about, I don't know what to call it. I don't want to call it sort of next-gen biofuels 2.0. So that's Meta 2.0.
Yes,
maybe that's it's either Meta biofuels 2.0 or it's biofuels 3.0, because it's not just going to be biofuels. If you look at where oil goes, then half of it goes into transport, and a big chunk of that will go electric. The longer distance stuff might well go to hydrogen, but it could go to synthetic fuels and aviation. We're also, by the way, there's another trend, which is we're going to get a lot better at managing plastic and the sort of circularity
Absolutely.
and waste elimination and so on. I mean, some of the stuff that's just egregiously appalling, that one will be easier to fix, perhaps similar to something like, the ozone hole, HFCs.
Which we did quite a good job on.
Right. And plastic, we know where they come from. We know it's not, and there's value to capturing the plastics, and we've just got to, get
so
up.
The other area that I think is quite interesting is cracking the FOMOCO riddle. So that's about nitrogen fixation.
Yeah.
And why do plants do it so efficiently? And we use the Haber-Bosch process, which has been amazing, but amazingly energy inefficient. Heat inefficient. So I think the way people think we might crack that one is through a combination of quantum computing and machine learning to actually figure out what goes on in there.
So what will happen is quantum computing and machine learning and all of the above, all that stuff I think what it will do is it will shorten the innovation time frame, even in these physical areas. But at the end of the day, even if you had the answer, you still got to build it.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I would say is I'm spending personally more of my, intellectual curiosity time reading about biological systems, about ecosystems, about wilding, rewilding.
Yeah.
But at the moment, I just want to sort of understand those ecological systems. For instance, the role of ungulates, a role of cows. It's all very well to say, we should all be vegans. But actually, if you want to avoid closed canopy forests, then you need to have larger browsing animals. Okay.
Right,
so that says, because they break up the ground and they recycle nutrients and they create the openings for non-apex plants. So if you don't want to have just big mature trees, you want to have scrub and different trees, and you want to have different environments for biodiversity, then you need those big animals. So
it feels like we're starting to learn
it's amazing.
Ancient law again, all over again. We're more systematic about it now.
I would rather go back to what you said about using machine learning and so on as well, because very often we fall back on these sort of tropes of noble savages and I just think that's kind of it's condescending, it's wrong, it's probably factually wrong in the sense that there's no reason to believe that original peoples were living in environmentally stable environments. I mean, why did all the megafauna sort of suspiciously disappear just as humans arrived in country out there in zone after zone? And so I think I'm not going to endorse a romantic view of ancient wisdom, but I would like to draw. I mean, I think there's a lot of massive amounts we can learn, but we've got to supplement it with let's put sensors everywhere and figure out and accelerate our own learning to the absolute max, rather than just make some sort of broad, as I say, romantic assumptions and try and replicate some lost Eden, and that's not going to work.
Well,
not with 7 billion people in the world,
and soon to be 9,
soon to be 10, whatever. Exactly.
Yeah.
We've got to do better than that. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I think that you do a lot of is try to figure out how to persuade people on different parts of the political spectrum. And you're a bit of an enigma, because I'm going to read something you wrote. And it says, this is about something you wrote a few years ago. The fossil fuel industry is gorging on subsidies and externalizing substantial costs onto others, helping it to generate massive profits, of which it spends a meaningful proportion on lobbying, physical protection, community compensation, and even, as history has repeatedly shown, downright bribery. I mean, I almost feel it's Occupy Wall Street or Marxism today.
That's right.
But I know that you really see yourself as a blue-green. You're somebody who sits on the right of the political spectrum, perhaps not in that particular paragraph, but in
absolutely
how
in that
captured
paragraph.
yourself.
Absolutely, that paragraph is absolutely consistent with my being on the right politically, because what I was doing there, I know the piece that it came from was one where I argued that not only do we need to restructure the energy transport system, but we need to reform it socially. So the leadership, once we go through this process, will not be a bunch of 50-year-old white men, and I can say that because I am one. So you can't accuse me of being
35,
of being sexist or ageist, But we've got to have an inclusion. It's not just about gender inclusion, but it's about all of it. It's minorities. If you look at how many CEOs of US utilities that come from minority communities, it's appalling, absolutely appalling. And so that piece was a kind of call to arms. But it's entirely consistent with being on the right politically, because when a company takes some of its profits to lobby for the maintenance of a system where it's externalizing costs on others, that is not a libertarian paradise of low regulation. That is corporatism, pure and simple, or crony capitalism. And I think what you'll find is that people truly on the right are as appalled by that as people on the left. And I mean, so we talked about Marx. Now we're going to talk about Thatcher. Thatcher hated rent seeking.
Right.
It wasn't that she hated, just unions. She hated rent seekers, whether they were corporatists, fat cats, or whether they were on the left. And so it's not that I don't want to be, if I'm going to be called a Thatcherite, I'd like to be called a Marxist Thatcherite at least, because I am.
That's a
but
riddle.
It's about this rent seeking behavior and the externalization of externalities. And so yes, I do. But what I try to do a little bit is sort of culture hack and make these very provocative statements, which people on the kind of, the people who think they're libertarians, but actually haven't thought it through and are really just corporatists, just shills. I want to provoke them, because I want to raise the profile of, in a sense, I would call it the sort of the center right or the sensible right or the true right. You can call it what you want. That, as soon as you put innovation at the heart, and you really truly believe in things like polluter pays, but you also believe that there is a role of the non-private actors, the governments, in aligning, in setting a long-term research direction or a long-term direction to resolve whether it's social or environmental problems. As soon as you start, if we could kind of get more profile around that position, then I think we can start to have a lot more a more sensible discussion. We can move more quickly, we can get more bilateral action, and so on.
Well, you've done a lot of great work on that front through your speeches and the writings you've done since you left New Energy Finance. You also have this project going on, Project Bow, which seems really fascinating. Can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Well, thank you. I love talking about Project Bow. It's been an extraordinary experience over the last year. What happens about this time last year? I was reading stuff on Twitter, which I do a lot because it's my main sort of source of new information. Whenever a paper's published, whenever somebody does something really stupid, and so on. So I'm reading on Twitter, and by chance in my timeline, a tweet popped up from an Irish doctor in Sierra Leone, not somebody I follow, but came in my timeline. And what he tweeted was he's Dr. Niall Conroy from UCD in Dublin. But who has been commuting in and out of Sierra Leone to set up a neonatal intensive care unit at a hospital in a city called Bow. It's the third city in Sierra Leone. And his tweet really hit me hard, because he said, last night we had a power cut and 3 of our most vulnerable babies died. And surely this shouldn't happen with modern solar and whatever and so on. And it hit me very hard because, I work with policymakers and it's all and I've worked a lot on energy access. So I've been on the high level advisory group for Ban Ki-moon, set up something called Sustainable Energy for All, which has morphed into the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 around clean energy. I've worked on energy access issues. I've invested in a prepaid solar company in Africa. I understand the issues very well, and have, tried to help. But never have I kind of been confronted with, the sheer. Can you imagine a more vulnerable human than a premature baby in an African hospital in Sierra Leone with the lowest, the highest infant mortality rates in the world, and such an easy solution? So I contacted Dr. Conroy and said, look, if you can sort out the stuff on the ground, the hospital needs to provide some land, and we need to get the permits. I will. First of all, put in the first chunk of money myself. I've got a little foundation. But also I will get the design done. I'll get it built. I'll get it funded, and we can solve this problem. I will commit to you. And it took, we raised money. I got a few bigger donations from sort of, friends of Michael who are very nice and very generous. We got halfway there. That was enough to order the batteries. And then while those were being manufactured, we raised money for the panels. We raised £100,000 in total. The system costs about $75,000, so about $105,000. We also put fresh water, clean water in, so the nurses don't have to go and get a bucket of water. They can wash their hands between patients in the ward. We got it built by a fantastic NGO, which has an operation in Freetown called Energy for Access. I worked with friends. I worked with my wife on, to do the website and so on, and it went live in September. And what was amazing was, admissions were 70 babies a month, of which about up to 20 were dying, 12 to 20 were dying. So it was something around a sort of 15-20% mortality rate. Actually, that's higher than 15-25% mortality rate. Since it's gone in, admissions are up, because now everybody's bringing their baby, of course, and deaths appear to be much, much lower, so 3 to 5 a month. So it looks like it may be saving somewhere around a sort of 10 lives a month, over 100
That's
a year.
Amazing. So where can we learn more about Project Bow?
Well, so there's a website, www.projectbow.org. And there's lots more. And we'll be extracting we've learned about how to get through customs, how to design the system, the fact that medical equipment has to be more energy efficient, how all sorts of things. So
there's a lot that can be taken away to other parts of the world as well as needed. Yeah. We've had a wonderful conversation, Michael. Really appreciate your taking the time today. And where can we keep in touch with you? What's the best channel if people want to hear what you have to say? Well,
so I have a website. It's www.liebreich.com. And that's Liebreich. I apologize. Difficult to spell. So Liebreich.com. And from there, you'll find everything you need.
Yeah, some fantastic presentations. Thanks very much, Michael.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thanks for listening to the Exponential View podcast. If you're new to this podcast, please subscribe on your podcast platform to get the new episodes each week. And if you want to stay in touch with me, the best way to do that is to subscribe to the weekly wonder missive, Exponential View, which you can find at www.exponentialview.co. The Exponential View podcast is hosted by Azeem Azhar and produced by Maria Gavrilov. Nassos Papadopoulos is the audio engineer and Boyan Sabiacello the sound editor.